70,000 years ago. Across Eurasia, there's so many different human species, from the Denisovans to the Neanderthals to the hobbits. And then apparently there's this one group which was potentially the size of 1 to 10,000 people in the Near East, which subsequently explodes. And now everybody who's descended from Eurasia descends from this one group. And so I guess the question is, like, what happened? What did they figure out?
Yeah. So a typical assumption when people think about this, if you put it in the Paleolithic, they assume that it has to do with some kind of genetic changes. Now, Reichslab, there's no obviously big changes in the DNA, so it's a little bit of a puzzle. Neanderthals, for example, had larger brains, and in primates, larger brains usually goes along with more computational abilities, more ability to solve problems. So the expanding variant out of the Middle East, out of Africa, might have actually been less able at an individual level to process information. But if you look back over the more recent period of human history, you can see that it's a story of expansions of different populations. So, for example, in Africa, we have the Bantu expansion about 5,000 years ago, which actually eliminates a whole bunch of hunter-gatherer populations that previously existed in Africa. We have the remnant populations in parts of the Congo, in the Kalahari, and the Hadza, for example, in Tanzania. If you look at the Austronesian expansion, so that's the peopling of the Pacific, that was the expansion of one group of people at the expense of others. And of course, the Neolithic expansion into Europe is another example. So really, human history is a story of these different expansions. And it could be that this expansion across Eurasia, which then led to interbreeding, so we know it's the same species. Humans interbred with Denisovans and Neanderthals, as well as probably other species. There's a ghost species in there. This could be just institutional changes. So if you have institutions, for example, that interconnect your population, you can maintain more sophisticated technology. And some paleoanthropologists, for example, have speculated, with some evidence, that the expanding populations had projectile weapons, so bows and arrows. And humans have periodically gained and lost bows and arrows in different parts of the world. So in Australia, for example, bows and arrows are never invented. In the New World, when the arrivals populations probably didn't have bows and arrows, but then later developed bows and arrows.
Is the basic answer, like, it could be something like bows, but we don't know exactly what it was? Or
Yeah, we definitely don't know exactly what it was. Okay. So we know that this population expanded, and there does seem to be some tool indications to suggest more complex technology. Probably technology usually goes along with social organization. So, for example, if you look at Australia, which is a continent of hunter-gatherers, there's an expansion about 6,000 years ago out of northern Australia, which eventually takes up 7/8 of the continent. And they had a new social organization, including rules about who you marry. You had linguistic exogamy, and rituals that interconnected populations. So rather than having local rituals and local myths, many communities would get together periodically to initiate the young men. And this would help bond that whole group. There'd be an exchange of technology and teaching that goes on at these. They'd spend a few months in the same place. So there was a lot of time for transmission.
Whenever this big wave happens, is it more of a sort of concrete technology, or is it more of a, like, I mean, especially if you consider the range of expansion that can often happen, right? It's like literally that same group goes from Siberia to England. Maybe it's hard to imagine it's like a single technology lets you explore this wide range, but it's also like the idea that like some cultural artifact is enough that like it gets transmitted over tens of thousands of years, and that's what gives you the edge. I'm curious how you think about like what could possibly be this like driving engine.
The way I describe it in The Secret is that it's a package of things. So another good example would be the Inuit expansion out of the north slope of Alaska. And they expand all the way across the Arctic and eventually get to Greenland. And they have a whole package of social practices, which helps keep them interconnected. And then they have bows and arrows, which the group they're exterminating as they go along, the Dorset, doesn't have. They have dogs and sleds. They have, along the coast, they have boats, so they're doing whaling. So there's a whole package that puts together that allows them to outcompete and eventually exterminate the Dorset.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens, though, is the Dorset probably had better technology, but they expanded, they spread out, their languages diversified, they lost contact, and they began losing technology. So you want to see this as a dynamic pulse. There were probably expansions and then collapses, another expansion, another collapse, right?
Oh, interesting.
It's not one giant long march to victory.
And then this process, which has happened many times, where the population gets cut off or something, is that when you say it's a sort of cycle? Is there some reason why the over time that knowledge gets fragmented and breaks apart and populations disperse, or is
I think there's a cultural evolutionary dynamic that's part of this because languages will naturally diversify. And then as that diversify, there's less contact. People sometimes get inclined to marry endogenously, and especially if there's enough people around locally, why go all the way over there? And those people are getting more culturally different, so they're seeming a little bit like outsiders. And then,
Interesting. Okay.
So the tough part that humans have always had is to stay unified because of the natural effect of geography and learning locally is going to tend to fragment us.
So in The Secret, you describe this interesting startup problem where if you don't have that much accumulated cultural knowledge, developing the ability to do social learning isn't as valuable. But if you don't have the ability to do social learning, you don't have that much accumulated cultural knowledge in your tribe or group. So how is this problem solved?
Yeah. So before I get to solving the problem, I just want to sketch for the listeners that the question is why is this cumulative cultural evolutionary process that is so important for humans relatively uncommon in the natural world? It seems like just our lineage. I mean, there was a bunch of split-off lineages, but now it's just us. So to understand that is this idea that you just mentioned where you're imagining an increase in brain tissue that's going to be costly. And I can put that towards individually figuring the problem out for myself, or I can put it into learning from others. And in a world without very much cumulative culture, there's not going to be very much useful information in the minds of everybody else. So I should use that brain tissue for individually solving problems. And so it's hard to get this runoff where our brains get bigger for the purposes of learning from others. So, and then the question is, how do you get past that valley? So the case I make in Secret is that in the, say, 3 million years ago, 2 million years ago, there were several factors that came together. The first factor is the rate of change of environments. So you get this increase in the fluctuation of environments. So you're getting more environmental changes. And in cultural evolution, a lot of theory shows that there's a certain rate of change which is favorable to cultural evolution. It's got to be slow enough so that the information is of your parents and the previous generation is useful, but not so slow that you might as well just encode it in the genes. So that's one. Second thing is we're a ground-dwelling ape, which means we have hands like chimpanzees and gorillas, and we can potentially use tools and whatnot. But unlike them, our ancestors may have been savanna-dwelling apes, which meant we may have lived in large groups. So in mammals live in larger groups when they have to deal with predators. And the predator guild in Africa at that point was quite thick. There were a lot of deadly predators. So paleoanthropologists think that our ancestors may have lived in large savanna-dwelling apes. And if you have a lot of individuals, if the culture is sparse, the bigger the group, the more chance that there's someone doing something useful in the larger group. And so that means it's easier to get across the threshold. So those are three of the main factors that might have allowed our lineage, as opposed to all the other lineages around, to cross this. We were already a big-brained primate. We had hands. We're living in these large groups on the savanna, and the climate changed during this period so as to make us,
And how big were these groups?
Well, I mean, nobody's really sure, but maybe a few hundred individuals.
Okay. And before the agricultural revolution, was there still this transmission of information across different groups?
Yeah. So, I mean, lots of different evidence suggests that groups were moving trade goods. So well back into the Paleolithic, we see trade. Often we see some genetic transmission.
The expansions and so forth.
And so talking about the expansion, like that's something where the ancient DNA is useful because the Neanderthals in Europe, the DNA suggests they lived in very small groups, but the DNA of the expanding group suggests a larger population. So those would have been two different collective brains there as well.